Shiatiki Sumo Moloki Wash. Shiatiki Sumo Moloki Wash. Shiatiki Sumo Moloki Wash. Shiatiki Sumo Moloki Wash. Kepakaki Ahashil Kuku. Pakaki Ahashil Kuku.
Hello, and welcome to Reclaiming Our Stories, Voices of Indigenous Peoples of California. I'm your story weaver, Victorio L. Shaw, a citizen of the Hoopa Valley Tribe and chief judge for the Shingle Springs Band of Miwok Indians and the Robinson Rancheria Tribal Courts. In this podcast, we sit down with Indigenous leaders, artists, historians, and community voices to share stories rooted in land, culture, and lived experience. These conversations invite us to listen more deeply to the histories, perspectives, and knowledge that continue to shape California today. Thank you for joining us. Welcome, Terria. How are you?
Thank you so much. I'm well.
Thank you for joining us. It's really nice to meet you. I'm wondering if you could tell our audience a little bit about what you do with Heyday.
Okay. So my position here for the past 10 years has been the Heyday Berkeley Roundhouse Director. What that means is that I'm in charge of California Native Publishing. So since our beginning, basically, we've published books about California, focusing on and authored by California Native people. When I say California Native, that refers to the more than 100 federally recognized and more than 50 non-federally recognized tribal nations within the state of California. So those are the groups that we focus on. And we also, in addition to publishing 2 to 4 books a year, we also publish a quarterly magazine called News from Native California. So that's what I've been doing. I love it. This is the best job I've ever had, and I consider it my life's work.
Well, you're doing an amazing job as someone who loves to read News from Native California. I love what you have done, and just Heyday Publishing in general is a really important voice for California Native people.
Thank you.
Could you just tell the audience a little bit more about Heyday Publishing, how long it's been around, and maybe approximately how many books you've published over the years?
Oh my, that's a big old question, but Heyday has been around since 1974. And we were founded by our founding publisher was a gentleman by the name of Malcolm Margolin. He passed away this past year. And Malcolm, if you can imagine, I tell people that, maybe not everybody understands the reference, but he looks like this comic character that they called Mr. Natural. And so he kind of looked like a mythical type of character. But he had a lot of relationships with tribal people throughout the state over the decades, something he cared deeply about. But in addition to publishing about California Native stories with Heyday, we have 4 pillars total. So we have the California Native pillar. We also have history, social justice, and nature. So outside of what we publish with the Roundhouse, we also publish about, I would say, probably about 10 to 12 books a year or so. And we're an independent publisher. We're a nonprofit publisher, so we're not huge, and we punch above our weight. And people really appreciate the quality of our books and everything. But yes, we are proudly an independent publisher based out of Berkeley, California.
Thank you for that. And for those of you listening, if you haven't checked out News from Native California, I highly recommend it. If you are a California Native person and you flip through some of the magazine, you'll certainly see some people maybe some of your relatives, some of your favorite artists, storytellers, and it's just really exquisitely presented. The color and the graphics, it's a very high quality publication. Could you just talk a little bit more about News from Native California and sort of what the mission is behind it?
Okay. What I appreciate, I'll say, I'll talk personally, like what drives my work all the time is the fact that the people that are highlighted in the magazine are folks that are doing important cultural work, environmental work, scholarly work, leadership work in tribal communities across California who may otherwise never have the opportunity to be featured, especially on the cover of a magazine, but they're the most deserving, in my opinion. It's something that, and every time an issue of the magazine comes out, it's almost like I forget how big of a deal it is to be on the cover of a magazine. People beam with pride, people order multiple copies for their family members and their friends and their communities. And, our magazine, we have a lot of folks that subscribe that run educational institutions, tribal libraries, and, maybe like health clinics and things. But those books don't generally stay there for the reason that you just stated. Like people will, sit down, they'll open up a copy of the magazine and they'll say, oh, my cousin's in there or my auntie's in there. And then the magazine just walks off and it's gone, that sort of thing. So I'm really, really proud of that. I'm proud of the community that we maintain and build, and not just the stories that we share, but even we're able to keep people kind of updated on things going on. The most popular mainstay in the magazine is the calendar, the events calendar page. We also have an online website, and all anybody ever looks at there is the calendar. the calendar.
The calendar is fabulous, yes. Yeah. It tells all the big times, the powwows, art exhibits, gatherings. It's great.
We're super proud of it.
That's a great background, and thank you for sharing that. So today's episode is entitled We Tell Our Own Stories. And I'm wondering if you could just talk a little bit about the importance of us being able to tell our own stories as Native people and California natives in particular.
The main thing that I can see that I notice when a tribal person tells their own story about their own people or even their neighboring tribal people, that a lot of times people from outside of the community don't pick up on are a lot of nuances. Sometimes people interpret things that aren't happening, or sometimes people miss things that are happening that are important. So when I notice when we tell our own stories, there is a urgency to get things right, to be respectful, and for people to have understanding. I think that this is paramount and important, because I've gotten people from outside community sometimes where I've had to remind them things that are kind of obvious. People will come to us with a story about a certain tribal group of people, and then I'll read it over and I'll say, did you talk to anybody from that community? And they'll say no. And which is, it's a little bit of a problem. It's like, you want to, in any kind of a story, I was educated as a journalist, and we wouldn't be able to get away with that with any other group of people. We would have to talk to people. If we were doing a story about a particular community, we would have to talk to some people from that community. But for some reason, when people come from outside of our community to talk about us, they don't feel that that's obvious all the time. With us, with tribal people, we have everybody to talk to. And because, we're such a marginalized group of people in our own homelands, everybody wants to talk, everybody wants to share, everybody wants to be heard, because, it's not all the time that we're listened to.
Right, exactly. This next question, I think you touched on it a little bit, but I'd like you to expand upon what happens when we don't tell our own stories, and why do you think that people don't reach out to us when they tell our stories? And do you think that maybe it goes back to this idea of seeing Indian people as sort of non-human, almost like they're observing us like we're wild animals? Or am I off there? Do you think it's related?
Yes. What happens when we're not involved in telling our own stories? Back to sort of what I mentioned before, people miss things. there's ramifications for that a lot of times. And then the other question that you asked about why people don't do that, that's a huge question. It is an other type of situation. Like people are used to seeing, if people have had any kind of interaction with tribal history or anything like that, a lot of times, unfortunately, it's like maybe in a very sterile environment, like a museum or like through a book, written by somebody that's not a tribal person, which I am very, very happy to say that we're very fortunate to be in a time where there's lots of California Native scholars, historians, and, authors and, attorneys, those sorts of things like that. And there's lots of books out there now written by California Native people and lots of articles, and publications. In addition to our publication, there's a lot of tribally based publications. Like they have Haminat magazine, that's the Serrano people, the Avatun people of San Manuel publish. And then there's also Miehue magazine that's published out of Agua Caliente Band of Cahuilla. We are still the only publication that does statewide coverage of tribal communities, but it is important for us to tell our own stories because, if we don't, there's a lot of misinformation out there. There's a lot of, otherism, for lack of a better word or term or phrase, and it perpetuates this idea that we are either not real or we exist in the past or, something of that nature for sure.
Right. Sort of the symbolism. We're like a symbol rather than a living group of people.
The vanishing Indian. Yeah.
Right. I'm wondering if you could maybe share some of those examples of some of those nuances that come through when we're telling our own stories, or some of the little things that we're able to get from those stories.
The example that I most often use is that people will take, they say really condescending things about tribal people, like, Indians always speak in metaphors, or, and the way that that tribal people talk, it's not about things, in my experience, it's not metaphorical or symbolic at all. It's literal. So, for example, I went to Humboldt State University, and so I love the Pacific Northwest of California very, very much. The people there were very good to me when I was going to school there, and still are every time I'm in the region. And so one of the things that I remember when the fight and efforts were going on to get the dams off of the Klamath River, something that you'd hear people say all the time was that if the salmon don't exist, we can't exist. We won't exist as a people. That's not symbolic or metaphorical. That is literal. That's a literal statement. So what people were finding was happening during the time when there was all the environmental corrosion that was happening with the Klamath River, and the salmon weren't able to survive, is the people in that region that were from there, the indigenous people, specifically the Yurok people, a lot of people were moving out of Klamath. They weren't able to find work. They weren't able to, there's no grocery stores and stuff out there to feed people. They live off of that river. They were having to move away. So the statement that we can't exist as a people, you're not able to live as a tribe, as a people, if the salmon aren't there, that's a literal statement. That's not a symbolic statement. And people that don't have that understanding will state it as that's a symbolic statement, that's metaphorical. It's not. It's literal. The people can't live together as a tribe, as a people, without that ancestor, that relative, to sustain them, to feed them and keep them going.
Terria, I think that's a really great point, is that we as Native people are so tied to our environment in a way that other groups in this country may not be. And if we can't live in our traditional environment and access our traditional sources of survival, then the entire existence of the tribe suffers. Our people aren't as connected. We don't gather. We don't share stories. We don't attend the cultural events in the same way. And it's a major disruption to our way of life. So you're 100% correct that we literally can't survive as a tribe without our salmon, up there where I'm from. One of the things I wanted to touch on is a nuance that I see that doesn't really get picked up on that much, is that we as Native are very humorous, and we like to joke around a lot. I think when we're always portrayed as sort of like the stoic group of people that's quiet and serious, but if you really get to know Native people, we are always joking and laughing. Can you just maybe talk about Native humor?
Or tragic, right? We're just so tragic. We're just so sad, that sort of thing like that. We did some years ago. It was a special issue of the magazine focused on love. And because, we don't get to see tenderness much in tribal communities and things like that, at least, from the outside in, people don't look at us as being loving, tender, people and everything like that. I remember I heard Natalie Diaz talk about that one time, saying, we don't get to show tenderness too much. And so I remember when the magazine came out, it was a Chuck and Kayla Begay's wedding photo on the cover of the magazine and stuff. And one of their relatives or family members, they said, yeah, when I saw this come out, I was like, this is a joke, right? Just kind of teasing, that sort of thing and stuff. And people do tease when people are on the cover of the magazine or that sort of thing, kind of, it's a prideful thing. But sometimes, like I know where I come from on Torres Martinez Reservation and everything like that, people like got a neighbor or an old neighbor who I grew up with and everything like that. And like, gosh, I don't know how he gets by day to day in life and everything like that, but he's got such humor about it. Like, it's all funny. It's like, I'm like, gosh, are you an actual person or you a character? You come across so much like a character.
Oh, we have so many characters, right?
Yeah.
The reservation that I work at is just full of characters. In my own tribe, it's just, you just run into so many characters. And
it's true.
I think that's why so many of us really fell in love with the series Res Dogs, because it really captured the characters that we have within our groups of people and how funny we can be, and sort of that idea of poking fun at each other, right? Is kind of a way of showing love. I just really appreciated that. So since you're a publisher and you're in the business of making things available for the public, how do you see that tension between making things visible for the public but also having responsibility to protect certain things as well?
Our authors are really, and thank goodness for all of them, they're really very conscious about all of that. A lot of our authors with the Roundhouse program are first-time authors, and they question so much. Tribal people in particular question so much, like everything, from cookbook authors to children's book authors. They're always questioning whether I have the cultural authority to be able to share something. They always question themselves, and they're always talking to community, and they're always asking people who they believe might have more knowledge than they do to be able to get things cleared up or to answer a question that they might have. They don't go into it with a lot of hubris and certainty as people that maybe from more privileged backgrounds have. There's a humility that our authors go into it with. I'm happy that I get to be, a tribal person, and that if they're coming to, if they're along the writing process, if they're having challenges, I'm always honored that people have been able to come to me and talk about the challenges that they're having, the questions that they have. Is this the right thing to do? That sort of thing. So I'm happy to be here for them. But yes, more so than me, because I'm not from every tribe, our authors, our native authors are very, very aware of their responsibilities to be able to keep things safe and also to be able to share things in a way that's respectful to the communities that they come from.
Excellent. So my last question, what I'd like to finish on before we ask you to share some work, is what excites you about the future of Native storytelling?
I love to be able to share about things that people don't ask us about. I love to be able to, there are very standard questions that I've found working in media for a long time that we're asked about or we're featured about. They're usually have to do with culture, environment, or economic development. Those are the things that tribal people are asked about. We're not asked a lot about our lives and things. Like, for example, what I end up sharing with you, I wrote a book, a memoir called I Love You So Many, and it's a Native travel memoir. Like, this isn't the first one we've published. We also published a book called An Indian Among Los Indigenas by a Karuk author by the name of Ursula Pike, and about her time in Bolivia in the Peace Corps. And that was wonderful and fascinating. And I just thought that her perspectives of being an Indigenous woman from the North, serving in a community of Indigenous people from the South was a fascinating story. But no one would have ever asked her anything about that. So I like those sorts of things, showing us as people that come from a living culture and a living society, or living cultures and living societies, I feel is so important to let people know, or get people, accustomed to the idea that we come from a living culture and that their images of tribal people that they probably have are probably, the reality is starkly different. I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, no, I really like the point you just touched on, because it's a personal point that I always try to bring up when I talk about my artwork, is that we are Native people. We are living modern people. We have maybe values that go way back, but we are able to adapt and evolve just like all peoples are. And
yes, we take what we've had and bring it with us. It's not like we're living in the past. No, we take the past with us, the values, the cultural understandings with us, and we carry it forward in our life.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for the conversation. It's wonderful to finally meet you. I hope maybe someday I'll make it in the mag,
That would be great. We love artists in the magazine.
Yeah, so I can get teased by my cousins. That'd be great. We would love for you to share an excerpt from one of your books.
Yes. This is the preface from I Love You So Many, a Native memoir of adventure, culture, and family. The idea came to me on a walk through the town of Trinidad, Sancti Spiritus, Cuba. That day, Europeans filled the cobblestone streets of the colonial city, wearing light-colored cottons to save them from the damp Cuban heat. I wore stretchy black leggings, a fitted Dodgers jersey-style t-shirt. My hair, happy to be in Cuba, got puffy and full in the humidity. Though none of the tourists resembled me, I thought there must be a lot of other California Native people who've had their own experiences traveling, being someplace else in the world than where they came from. And I would like to learn about them. In 2015, I'd become the editor of News from Native California, a magazine that shares the stories of California's Native communities. My instinct told me that if I was interested in California Native travel stories, a lot of other readers would be too. So in 2018, we published a special issue titled Native California Around the World. I've never had more fun editing an issue of the magazine. We put out a call for submissions, and the response confirmed what I'd thought. I was not the only California native person who'd been bitten by the travel bug. There was Jolie Varela, Tule River Yokets, and Numu, the founder of Indigenous Women Hike, a Paiute man who had spent a good deal of time sharing his culture in Spain, among other countries, a young Paiyoachim woman who haggled in markets in China, a Kumeyaay elder who had visited the Maori in New Zealand, and even a Nomlaki, Pomo, Yuki, Lakota Cherokee artist who was living in Japan. I love watching travel shows like the late Anthony Bourdain's No Reservations or House Hunters International. I follow dozens of travel-focused accounts on TikTok, and I'm especially drawn to travel media created by people of color, such as the YouTube videos of Tinaj Tino or Dr. Kiona's How Not to Travel podcast. Yet I have found that Native American media about travel is rare. I know of one book about a California Native travel experience, which my employer, Heyday, proudly published and is one of my favorites, Ursula Pike's An Indian Among Los Indigenas. There are only a couple of films that come to mind about Native traveling. Smoke Signals, and in that movie, Indians leave their reservation to go to another reservation, which one could argue is actually international travel. As the characters Velma and Lucy say about the United States, that's as foreign as it gets. Hope you two got your vaccinations. I have a t-shirt with this exchange on it. And then there's the 2020 film Indian Road Trip, produced out of Canada. A lot of people in travel media mainly address aesthetics, monuments, pretty-looking food, which may or may not actually be delicious, landscapes, activities on excursions, or even worse, they are participating in global gentrification, talking about how cheap their rent is in places like Thailand or Colombia, or comparing their European grocery bills to what they spend at Target. If the country's local people are featured, they're often part of the scenery. I don't see a lot of people out there exchanging about friendships or culture. Nevertheless, I'm convinced that travel does not have to be an act of colonialism. I know that this is true because North America is filled with native peoples who lived migratory in nature. This was the case with my people, the Cahuilla, for a period of time. This migration period is in our creation stories. It has only been since our people were forced onto reservations in the 1800s, with all migratory movement under strict control, that tribal people in the U.S. were relegated to being very specifically place-based. I travel to learn about history and culture, to share, to make new friends, and in turn, I learn more about myself. People try to figure out where I'm from, Mexicana, Brasileña, Colombiana, but when I reply that I come from a tribal reservation within the boundaries of the United States, the exchange is usually something wonderful, even when I'm the first Native person they've encountered. People I've met internationally are often far more educated about Native peoples of North America than those I meet in the United States. It's much easier for people within our occupied territory to feel okay with stolen lands, genocide, and ill-gotten gains when they believe we no longer exist. I come from a culture that was almost completely annihilated because of settler colonialism. So the greatest gift I gain from traveling is the opportunity to show complete acceptance of another culture in the way that I would like people to accept mine. I have made a lot of mistakes, of course. As you will read, I haven't always understood cultural nuances. I have also changed people's names in my stories to save others from potential bashfulness about any mistakes they have made as well. But it is wonderful to have a life where you are always learning. The title phrase of this book, I Love You So Many, comes from people I know for whom English is not their first language. One of my friends from Cuba, referring to a couple we knew, told me, she loves him so many, and I never forgot it. Though that sentence might look grammatically unusual, it captures a specific sentiment perfectly. I love so many of my fellow human beings, so many places, so many experiences. I haven't always had the chance to connect with people everywhere I've gone, but when I have, the experiences brought me closer to understanding and loving myself as well. This book is also about my journey inward, and I hope these accounts convey the lived experiences of connectedness that is central to tribal storytelling, where the point of a story isn't always what happens at the end, but what goes on during the journey.
That was beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing that with us.
Thank you.
Our guest has been Terria Smith, native storyteller, publisher, and a very important member of California culture. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much as well. It's an honor to have been invited.
Reclaiming Our Stories podcast is made possible with support from the 11th Hour Project, the Weingart Foundation, and By the People Conversations Beyond 250, a nationwide initiative led by the Federation of State Humanities Councils in partnership with the Smithsonian Center for Folklife and Cultural Heritage. We also thank the Autry Museum of the American West for partnering with us in hosting our live podcast event. Together, these partners help make it possible to share stories that deepen understanding of the many cultures and histories that shape California.
Hey, oh, hey, ha. Hey, oh, hey. Hey, oh, hey, ha. Hey, oh, hey. Oh, hey, oh, hey. Hey, hey, oh, hey. Oh, hey, oh, hey. Hey, hey, oh, hey. Ene inoha, no no kushka. Ene inoha, no no kushka. Ene inoha.
Let me welcome our second guest, Cristina Gonzales. How are you, Cristina?
I'm good. Thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here.
Could you please tell the audience a little bit about yourself?
My name is Cristina Gonzales. I am Coastal Band Chumash. I currently work for Tachiyoka tribe as a registrar, like a museum registrar. And I am also a lecturer in American Indian Studies at Fresno State.
Wonderful. What kind of classes are you currently teaching?
I teach American Indian Studies. So my current load is Introduction to American Indian Studies, as well as a topics course, which is Curation, Ethics, and Laws. And it's a class that I kind of came up with, which touches on NAGPRA, which is the Native American Grace Protection and Repatriation Act, as well as curation, some anthropology, and just kind of like the history of collecting, whether they're ancestors or things, and the process of returning them back to their home communities.
Can you tell us what inspired you to focus on that specific aspect of federal Indian law?
Wow. I am not quite sure. So when I was in grad school, I did have an internship under state parks. But before that, we had a speaker come to our class, and she was the state parks NAGPRA coordinator at the time, and her name is Paula Henham. She's retired now. But I did my internship under her. It was very interesting. It was a new law that was passed, a federal law that was passed in 1990. California passed their own version in 2000, 2001, but it wasn't funded. And so it was kind of like in limbo. And I thought this is very interesting because the state law applies to non-recognized tribes, and it gives non-recognized tribes a seat at the table and a chance to consult on getting their ancestors and their cultural items and their things back. And when I did my internship, it was really interesting. And it was very spiritually difficult because I had to work amongst lots of ancestors in storage, right, who are anxious to go home. And so when I was working in that environment, helping to prepare repatriations and learning the other side, I'm consulting with tribes. It was just something I was really interested in. And my internship just made it more. And I did my thesis on Cal-NAGPRA, which isn't as robust as it is today. And in my thesis, I just focus on the importance of consulting with tribes, working with Native people and listening. There was a spirit of the law, which is to return things, which is amazing because we actually have to have a law that says people have to return things if they have, if they get federal funding, which brings us to laws, period, right? We have to have civil rights laws. We have to have religious freedom laws. We have to have voting rights laws, right? Because obviously people are not ensuring that people are getting these things and these things are happening. And so we have laws, basic federal laws that say that these things have to happen.
Yeah, it's really important. It is very heavy work. I know a lot of people who work in that area and also as like cultural monitors when there is a site that's being disturbed and there's remains, ancestors. Today's episode is about telling our own stories. And I'm wondering if when you're doing that work and you're working with the remains of ancestors and the objects, how does that factor into our story? It's almost like, to me, it's like a part of our story that was taken. What does it mean to get those objects back for tribal people?
Oh, it's a good feeling. A lot of times the things that I'm working on are not necessarily my people. These are my neighboring people. These are our hereditary trading partners that I'm working with. And for me, it is amazing because these things are, these are people, but they're also old things and they're also new things. And these are things that were made a traditional way. These were things that are alive. For us, we see them as alive, especially if they're really organic material or even tools. These things are alive. And it reminds us to be careful, right? It reminds us to be careful of how we are approaching this work, because we have to approach it in a good way. We have to approach it with an open heart and understanding, right? Because they are alive. And so we have to almost talk to the ancestors in this work and their things and let these things know, I'm just here trying to help. And when we're talking about stories, when we're talking about how does that relate also to today and the stories that those things carried? Because when I see some of these things, I can see the story. It may not be able to tell you, but it does tell you. It can't verbally tell you, but you can look at it and you can see what it did, what it was responsible for, what its duty was, what its job was. It can tell you where it's from, what were the plants that went into making these things. And that story is important because we have to remember that story in order for those things to come home, but also so we can continue to make these things and continue to practice these things so that we can, in fact, talk to our ancestors, so we can have a relationship with the past, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. That's beautiful. Yeah, there is almost a conversation that occurs with those ancient objects. The maker's essence is still with them and they are alive. That's really beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. So in terms of stories, as Native people, why is it important for us to tell our own stories? And what happens when we don't tell our own stories and we allow other people to tell our stories?
So that is very interesting because since the beginning of time, we have not been able to tell our own story. Our story was written for us. And this is played out throughout history, right? Through scientific racism, through the doctrine of discovery, through all of these things. Decisions were made about us, stories were made about us. Even on the dawn of our colonization, there's stories that were written about us. And it's interesting when we look at those stories that were written today by maybe, these early Spanish colonizers to our coast, how they've seen us. And we didn't have a chance to tell them what we were doing or how we were doing it. And I think that part's important, because part of today is reclaiming that story, is reclaiming that narrative. Because again, we always hear the victors are the ones that write the books. They're the ones that write the stories. So it's so amazing when we see authors and we see cultural practitioners and we see people today that are practicing these things, because they are writing the story of how it should have been, right? But there's a lot missing in between. But some of these things are sleeping, but there's lots of things that are missing from that narrative. But I think slowly, by reclaiming these stories, by telling them from our words and from our eyes and from our view, I think we get to control what that narrative is about us.
Absolutely. And so many of the tribes in the United States, their names aren't even what we called ourselves. Those were lost and were referred to by the colonizers that encountered us. And they might have taken the word from a neighboring tribe or something that's completely unrelated to what the people themselves referred to themselves, them as, which was usually people.
And reclaiming that name too, right? You see some of especially there's a couple of our California tribes that have kind of ditched the colonizer name that was bestowed upon them and reclaiming their names for themselves. And it's really hard because a lot of us, we weren't organized by tribe. It goes back to people, right? We are people. And, when we talk about where we're from, where are these villages that we're from? So when I say I am from Limu, I am from certain villages on the Santa Cruz Island, or I am from certain villages on the Southern California coast. It doesn't necessarily include Chumash. It includes, the villages, the village names, etc. So it's beautiful to see people reclaiming those things back too.
I'm wondering if you could speak upon California specifically. California is so unique in relation to the rest of the world. What is something about the story of people in your part of California that makes you unique?
Whoa, so California is big, just as you mentioned. And I'm not sure a lot of people know California. We have the most number of diverse tribes, the most diverse native languages. We have so many different cultural areas of California, and our ecosystem itself is very different. You can be in the redwoods or in the desert or on the coast. You can be in so many different areas. And for Native people, we all have our own place in California where we have that special relationship with that environment, with that land, with that ecosystem, with those plants and birds and animals, and with our neighbors, right? We have that special relationship with who is also around us. And I think that is hard because we also have our origin stories, how a lot of us came to be. And some of us have stories of what we call migration, and some of us don't. But some of us, it's not necessarily a migration. It's more of the ecosystem around us that's changing, right? So when we're thinking of the Chumash people and us leaving the island and going to the mainland, I always think, oh, wow. So we crossed that little bridge of ocean from the island and went to Ventura, Santa Barbara, and all of these different areas. But we also have other tribes, specifically where I live now. I live in Yokut's territory today. This is where I grew up. And a lot of their stories are also around water. And when you think of history, right, because when we are also scientific people. And when we look at science and we look at the history of things, you can see there was lots of water in the middle of California. During Pleistocene times, you have historic ancient lakes and how these lakes and rivers also coincide with a lot of our stories. And it's really neat. It's really neat to see how science, proven Western science, solidifies what we've been saying. And it kind of makes our spot in California where we come from very unique.
Absolutely. I'm interested by science in that I feel that sometimes the modern culture's reliance or the prevalence of science in our modern culture overlooks a lot of history and our story. So can you talk about maybe the downside of that, or just science being looked at as being superior maybe to stories and our ways of passing on knowledge, and maybe what gets left out?
So when I think of science, I'm thinking of maybe traditional ecological knowledge. I'm also thinking of stories, right? So when I'm in my class, we talk about traditional ecological knowledge, and that is the science that Native people have that we've passed down. And a lot of people don't consider it science, when in fact it is. And a lot of our science has been majorly overlooked. And, you can even see how even fire is being treated today, and how Native people have viewed fire, and how there's cultural burns now, and all of these different issues with fire that we have now, and especially with new state laws with fire and with cultural burns. But a lot of our science is not considered science. And that goes back to, I always say this goes back to people, Native people, not being considered human. And therefore we are very simple. We're seen as a simple people. And we're not capable, I guess, of science, when this is something we've been living forever. And a lot of people don't understand. It could be the simplest thing, even cooking a dish. It could even be like my grandmother, when she would hit a rose bush. And I'm like, why is grandma hitting the rose bush? And later on learning, it's promoting growth on the plant. And these are just little things. These are just science things that are even little pieces of stories. There's science, and sometimes we don't even think about them as being science until maybe later we'll figure it out and we piece it together. But again, we almost have to become scientists, right? We have to have those little letters behind our name to be taken seriously sometimes, which, we got to play the game. So
That's true. You can't ignore the game. It's there. When you think about the stories that you carry, who do you carry them for, and how does that responsibility shape the choices that you make today?
So the stories that I carry today, I come from a very big family, and a lot of our family knowledge comes from those stories. I can hear stories of my great-great-grandmother and of different people in my family that I didn't even know. And it's really neat to hear these stories and have my son listen to them. My son he's an adult, but he's also special needs, but he listens to these stories, and now he's able to regurgitate these stories. And so a lot of times I carry these stories not only for my own personal amusement sometimes, but for my younger family that I spend time with, and I tell them the stories that I've heard. And for my son to listen to these stories, we also are spread around, right? I have a brother in Idaho. So do they get the stories all the time? No, they don't. They're not privy to a lot of these stories. And so a lot of times I'll try to share those stories too. And carrying these stories is hard because sometimes I also figure out I'm not remembering all of the story very accurately either. And so in our process, somebody either needs to write it down, like one of my uncles is doing, or we need to talk and tell these stories more often so we don't forget some of the little details that are in them. And I think through these stories, through spending time with family, these stories are able to be passed on to different family members. And hopefully those family members will remember, and they are able to pass those on to their kids. And I don't know, maybe somebody will write it down and it'll get written for sure in permanence.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Are there other ways of telling those stories? I'm thinking, other things come to mind, whether it's song or artwork. Are there other ways that you or other people can help tell their stories?
Right. So remember I had just mentioned about stories inside of some of these objects that we see in museums and institutions. So that is very similar, right? So when I'm making things, I do a lot of cordage work. I do some weaving. I do different types of things. And in those also carry stories. So when I'm also teaching these things, I'm also telling where these materials are from. I'm also talking about how I learned, because I did not learn on my own. Other people have taught me. Other relatives have taught me. And so I'm also telling that story of how things come to be and the story of those things, but also the people that are tied to them. Some of the songs that we sing with our Chumash cultural collective and our language teacher, and some of the songs that we have there, those songs are being shared. And the story of those, when we talk and when we sing those songs, we tell people, this is so-and-so song. This is a song that so-and-so wrote. And so those also carry stories. The things that we make carry stories. When we're especially when we're driving places, that's where a lot of these stories are shared. When we're in community and we're showing people how to make things or do things, there's more stories that are passed there. But I think in every little thing that we do, there's stories in it. And sometimes the story is going to live in the object or in the song when it's heard. So I may not be there to tell the story, but when somebody made something, that story is going to be living inside of that object, I hope.
Yeah, I love that, because it's like the feeling you get is part of the story. Stories don't just live in words. They live in feelings and emotions as well. The last question I have for you is about sharing stories in the modern world, and what tensions do you hold between visibility and protection when it comes to sharing stories in the public space or in especially digital spaces?
I am very sensitive when it comes to that in my work and in everything that I do, because for far too long, a lot of our stories have been recorded, right, by other people recording us, and people profiting off of this, or people learning things from this. And so in a way, I'm kind of very secretive about things. And especially when it comes to the work, especially in some of the work that I do. And I try to share enough with the public so that they can understand. But I really want to be sharing with my family and community so that they have an opportunity to learn and to know these stories and know these things and master these things first. Because, our stories were taken from us. We didn't have a chance to write our own stories. And now that we are able to do these things, we're able to record them, we can write them down, we can make things, we can sing, and we can do all of these things. I feel like a lot of times, and I don't want to relate it to like gatekeeping, but I also want to be protective of our knowledge, because I don't want some of these things to be taken and used or taken out of context, or you're only getting a sliver of information and you're missing the whole backstory that explains that sliver, it again being taken out of context. And it's hard. It's hard to figure out, how can I share this? And especially digitally, right? Because once we say it, once we record it, it's there. And you can't control where it goes from there. So how do you help your people? How do you help other Native people and pass these stories and pass this information on without bad happening, or without evil coming, or without it being used the way you didn't want it to? And I think that's the chance we take because we really want to share. We really want to share and we want to explain ourselves. We want to take this opportunity that we have to share our knowledge, share our stories, share our songs. And it's so hard because we want to do these things, but we don't know what will happen with it. I think that's the fine line we walk, right? And that's the same thing with even repatriation work, especially when we're thinking of the law, because when you're repatriating things, you have to sometimes back in the days, you had to explain why you want these back. Why is it important? Why? And you have to explain maybe a certain ceremony. Maybe you have to touch on certain things that are none of anybody's business, but you have to be able to say just enough so you can get things back. So you want to share just enough so people can understand. But again, how does that go back to helping your people? How does that go back to helping your family? How does that go back to helping your community or other Native people? That's the hard part.
Cristina Gonzales, wonderful to meet you. Thank you for sharing part of your story with us. And I'm really excited to learn more about your work and hopefully meet you in person someday. I have so many more questions, but thank you for joining us. Just tremendous, enlightening conversation. Have a blessed day. Thank you for being with us and sharing your knowledge.
Thank you so much, Kakinali.
Oh. I'd like to leave you with a question based on today's episode. What stories live in the land where you are? Who has carried them forward? And how are you listening? Before we wrap up, we want to invite you to something special. On Saturday, June 27th, Reclaiming Our Stories will be recorded live at the Autry Museum of the American West in Los Angeles. This live event will bring together voices from the podcast for an evening of conversation, storytelling, and reflection on Indigenous histories, cultures, and futures. If you'd like to experience the conversation in person, we hope you'll join us. You can learn more and reserve your spot at calhum.org. Thanks again to our guests, Terria Smith and Cristina Gonzales, for joining us today. You've been listening to Reclaiming Our Stories, Voices of Indigenous Peoples of California, created by California Humanities, a nonprofit partner of the National Endowment for the Humanities. To learn more about this podcast and the work of California Humanities, visit calhum.org. Until next time, keep listening because every story connects us to land, community, and to one another.
Reclaiming Our Stories podcast is made possible with support from the 11th Hour Project, the Weingart Foundation, and By the People Conversations Beyond 250, a nationwide initiative led by the Federation of State Humanities Councils in partnership with the Smithsonian Center for Folklife and Cultural Heritage. We also thank the Autry Museum of the American West for partnering with us in hosting our